So we'll start with our witnesses with the Canadian Produce Marketing Association, Mr. Lemaire, President. Ron, you're on. 5 minutes if you could, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and honourable members of the committee. On behalf of the Canadian fresh fruit and vegetable supply chain, I welcome the opportunity to share our recommendations for Budget 2021. Since the start of the pandemic, the fresh fruit and vegetable supply chain has seen massive shifts in our markets, changing retail sales patterns, the rise of e-commerce, and major disturbances in food service. We recognize there will be winners and losers as we emerge from 2020. Today, my comments will focus on the need for a financial protection mechanism for produce sellers in Canada, a tool which has long been a priority for our sector and has only been intensified by the COVID-19 environment. Other programs and tools which also require consideration include the swift deployment of the Universal Broadband Fund and other critical infrastructure, targeted tax credits for essential services to support required changes in COVID business practices, including the purchase of new equipment and PPE, and additionally, more effective programs to support our domestic food supply as an essential sector and bolster food security in Canada. Our recommendations can be found in our submitted brief and more information in our comprehensive report, which outlines 24 recommendations for government action to support our sector in COVID recovery. Now, we have an immediate need for a Canadian limited statutory deemed trust to effectively protect produce sellers during buyer bankruptcy in Canada. This is at no cost to the government and would provide an avenue to reinstatement of protection in the U.S. for our exporters. Growing, harvesting, packing, and selling fruit and vegetables comes with a number of risks. COVID has only created greater challenges as overhead and capital costs continue to rise, while returns are delayed until the product is sold and payment is collected down the supply chain, usually long after the farmer or produce seller has shipped their product. We know bankruptcies are coming. Federal support, loans, and credit have created a false sense of security. Economists have already coined the term zombie companies, which are leveraging federal programs or tapping banks for more credit. The pandemic over the next 2 years will drive Canadian produce companies into bankruptcy. We anticipate company failures, especially among hard-hit food service businesses, and these closures will be felt by urban Canadians, where their favorite restaurant will be missed, but they will be felt perhaps the hardest in rural Canada, where farmers will be forced off the family farm. In the case of an insolvent buyer, the current super priority provision for farmers fails to protect effectively our sector, as the terms of payment for fresh produce sales regularly extend beyond the 15 days between delivery and buyer bankruptcy as prescribed by the Act. Sellers of fresh produce are rarely able to recover their product, as other commodities are most often able to do under the BIA. Canadian fruit and vegetable farmers have already begun to identify a growing concern related to their accounts receivable and delays in payment due to COVID. Compared to the same period in 2019, the industry is seeing 25% or more of their accounts overdue. For some, this equals to over half of their estimated annual income. These delays put an increased burden and strain on the sector and are clear indicators of financial turbulence and potential bankruptcies down the line. Our lack of financial protection for produce sellers also means we can no longer access protection tools in the U.S. without incurring significant cost. For Canadians to file complaints in the U.S., we now must post a bond twice the value of the claim. The effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are already being felt south of the border. Over the first 3 quarters of this year, the value of complaints filed...
Ron, I don't want to interrupt you, but can you move your microphone just a little further from your mouth? The translators are having a bit of an echo.
No worries at all, Mr. Chair. Is that better?
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Lower it a little, they tell me.
How was that?
Technology is wonderful. There you go.
There we are. Over the first 3 quarters of this year, the value of complaints filed under the U.S. Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act for non-payment has risen by 52% in 2020 compared to 2019, and this is expected to rise even further in Q4. We urge the government to implement a Canadian limited statutory deemed trust to effectively protect produce sellers during bankruptcy in Canada. It would be fitting for a financial protection mechanism to be included in the Budget Implementation Act, as it would support one of our critical sectors and strengthen our own food sovereignty and security. This no-cost tool has been supported by this committee and the Agri Committee twice, most recently in Recommendation 15 from Enhancing Business Risk Management Report of November 2020. More importantly, the tool would protect sellers domestically, remove complications in cross-border trade in the U.S., and reduce potential costs imposed on Canadian consumers. In closing, thank you to the members for the opportunity to share our comments today, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lemaire. Taking about 3 minutes, splitting with Mr. Fragiskatis. Annie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for your presentations this afternoon. For the interest of time, I will address all my questions to Mr. Lemaire, and I'll try and get as much as I can for my 3 minutes. I listened carefully to your testimony, and especially with regard to your comments on the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act, the PACA. So my understanding is that the lack of a Canadian equivalent is a major barrier to our Canadian producers. Can you comment on what a Canadian version of the PACA would look like, and how would it compare to the U.S. PACA? And do you know if at this moment we're working on putting something like that in place?
So the quick answer to that is we have one more piece of a three-legged stool to put together, and that is the implementation of a financial protection tool that would protect produce sellers and farmers in the event of a bankruptcy, so the statutory deemed trust. The other tools that exist within the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act, under the leadership of the Liberal government with Minister Van Cleef back in 2000, there was a model put in place which operates now under the Dispute Resolution Corporation, where companies similar to the claims that happen through PAC in the US, we have a similar model here for dispute resolution. The only piece that we're missing is the bankruptcy tool. And the best of intentions of the federal government with protections for farmers under BIA, but unfortunately, they do not protect fresh fruit and vegetable farmers and sellers because of the unique attribute of how we grow, sell, and market our products. So we're outside of the tent relative to the protections of our current regulations.
And once a limited statutory deemed trust similar to the PACA is in place, can we expect preferential treatment for Canadian producers? And how quickly do you think that could be reinstated, if at all, very quickly?
Most definitely. So it doesn't require any presidential intervention in the U.S. to reinstate our access. It's a letter from the Perishable Agricultural Commodity Act team, basically their administration there, saying that they recognize the equivalency and that Canadian farmers exporting to the U.S. have access, preferential access again. We were the only country that had that access prior to 2014 when it was taken away. And they've identified that their intent is ideally to have it back in place.
Do we know why they took it away, Mr. Lemaire? I understand that we didn't hold perhaps our side of the bargain, or we didn't offer something similar to the U.S. producers. Yeah. Am I correct?
You're correct. 30 years ballpark of talking about getting there, and we got very close with creating the DRC, the Dispute Resolution Corporation, and the program within that model. But without the bankruptcy, they finally said we need that last leg of the three-legged stool to make it work. So okay. Inspection, destination inspection, dispute resolution, and bankruptcy.
Thank you. Thank you both, Mr. Fragiskatis.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Lemaire, you talked about the connection between the family farm and restaurants. Like all MPs on this committee, I'm very concerned about the future of restaurants beyond the fact that I have many in my community, as we all do. I grew up in that sector. My father was a restaurateur before his retirement. The same is true of his brothers, sisters. Every relative that we have in Canada actually is involved in the restaurant business. So I do want to ask you to elaborate on that, the connection between restaurants and the family farm. And I think we're also concerned about family farms, as we naturally should be. They're so central to the well-being of Canada. I wonder if you could elaborate on the the fact that the family farms of this country require restaurants to be strong and vice versa?
Most definitely. So if you can imagine the way produce is sold is while there are larger farms, the majority of the product is grown by small farm operations and then consolidated and then sold through maybe a dealer, which is another farmer, or to wholesale, or even through jobbers. And the jobber is a small operation. It could be one truck that picks up product either right from the farm and or from a wholesale market that distributes to restaurants in the Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver markets, the Calgary markets. The complexity of the procurement and distribution to food service trickles right back to the family farm. And because we have a term in produce, sell it or smell it, it's extremely perishable. You need to move the product quickly when it's pulled out of the ground, put into the system, and sold to the end user. And through that system, if you are moving product and the restaurant is not able to pay, it may have to go through 2 or 3 other hands before it goes down to the farmer, the grower. In some cases, there's a direct line, but as Ms. Sullivan mentioned, there's many pieces in our food system between the farmer and the end point of food. So any break in that system could cause a dramatic impact to the farmer himself.
Challenges all the more pressing in the context of COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. This is one, and I'll say, Ron, I don't know why we can't get it over the finish line. We've recommended a couple of times at Finance Committee this be done. I understand the Agriculture Committee has just recommended it be done. So if anybody's listening from Finance, let's get this damn thing done.